What survives of Aristotle's work?
After Aristotle left the Lyceum, many of his books and dialogues were never seen again. And other works of his were hidden in a vault for 2 centuries. Indeed, until the European Renaissance, Aristotle's writings suffered a pattern of loss and rediscovery. A good part of Aristotle's existing corpus may have been reconstructed by his students from lecture notes they took, or compiled years later by Aristotelians consulting secondary sources. Some of it may have been written by Aristotle or other members of the Lyceum as lecture preparation. Scholars now agree that the following works of Aristotle have been lost: dialogues in the same style as Plato, a vast collection of natural observations, popular publications, lectures on the good and Plato's forms, as many as 158 constitutions for Greek states, of which only the one for Athens survives. In the 1st century CE, Andronicus of Rhodes organized the existing Aristotelian corpus into its present form. But the earliest transcriptions of this are from the 9th century. The first critical edition of Aristotle's works was published by the Berlin Academy in 1831. It is estimated to represent as little as a fifth of Aristotle's total output, but in amounting to about 1,500 pages of small print in typical translations of Aristotle's collected works. It provides a substantial basis for scholarly reference today.
What was Leibniz's monadology?
Like René Descartes, 1596–1650, Leibniz thought that the basic unit of existence was substance. But whereas Descartes posited 2 primary kinds of substances, mind and matter, Leibniz posited one immaterial kind of substance, which had many instances that he called monads. Monads, according to Leibniz, are indivisible units of psychic or mental or spiritual force, each one of which perceived all of the other monads as an aspect of its own inner states. Each monad had an organic body that mirrored what was happening in other monads, but not as a direct effect. That is, like a cell containing all of the chromosomes and genes of the animal of whose body it is a part. For Leibniz, each monad contained within itself complete information about the rest of world. In addition, every monad contained its own future states, and of course, within those future states would be the monad's perception of the future states of every other monad. This world system of monads was created by God, and its main feature is the pre-established harmony that results in human perceptions of direct interaction and interrelationships. Monads form colonies and colonies of colonies with dominant monads at different levels of organization. These collections of monads constitute real physical existence. Both space and time are abstractions and not substances. Space, according to Leibniz, is the form of possible coexistences, and time is the form of possible successive existence, things that exist.
Who was Antonio Gramsci?
While Antonio Gramsci, 1891 to 1937, was in prison, he worked out his version of Marxism, which was mainly a revolt against Karl Marx's, 1818 to 1883, historical determinism. Gramsci's prison notebooks, compiled after his death, beginning in 1971, was edited for publication by Palmiro Togliatti, who succeeded him as leader of the Italian Communists. According to Togliatti, education and persuasion were the paths to reform toward a classless society. Rather than Bolshevism or direct political revolution. Gramsci's most influential idea has been what Togliatti called Gramsci's theory of hegemony, whereby the dominant class in society creates not only its own ideology, but also that of the classes dominated by it. All classes share the ideology of the dominant class. Hence, education and persuasion are important to change the social mass mind, so that political change can evolve. In this sense, it could be said that Gramsci was not only a member in spirit of the Frankfurt School, he was also a structuralist.
What was Aristotle's theory of the virtues?
Aristotle believed that virtue, or moral goodness, is a form of practical wisdom. It is neither determined by nature, nor is it precluded by nature. It is the result of thought, action, and habit. However, not everyone can be virtuous, according to Aristotle. His necessary conditions for virtue included high social status, wealth, good looks, being male, and being a free citizen. The specific virtues Aristotle talked about were limited to the traits admired in the ruling classes of the ancient world: pride, generosity, courage, nobility, temperance. This was partly the result of snobbery, and partly due to his sense that the practice of virtue required freedom from labor and drudgery. Still, Aristotle's ideas about how virtue is acquired and practiced can be made relevant to all adults in our own more democratic times. Moreover, we can add the virtues we care about, for example, compassion, to his limited list. Aristotle thought that we become virtuous first through proper training as children, and second by doing the acts that correspond to the virtues in question. For example, to become courageous, it is necessary to perform courageous acts over a period of time. Virtue for human beings, as for all other things, is the excellence of what makes them human. And what makes us human is our reason, our ability to think actively. Therefore, it is important that we deliberate before acting in ways that will develop our virtues. For example, the courageous acts performed by a courageous person must be done for the right reasons. The virtuous actions of good people will be performed because they already have the virtues in question. But every situation is unique, which is why virtuous action calls for rational deliberation beforehand. Aristotle advised that a good rule of practical reason is to aim for the middle or mean. Courage, for example, is usually somewhere between cowardice and foolhardiness. In aiming for the mean in this way, we should overcorrect for our known faults. Thus, because we tend to be fond of pleasure, we should subject choices that are pleasant to a special scrutiny.
How did falsification work according to Karl Popper?
Popper, 1902 to 1994, postulated a hypothetico-deductive method. From the hypothesis together with descriptions of initial conditions certain future events or known past events could be logically deduced. If the hypothetico-deductive method were applied to the past, it worked as a form of explanation. If it was applied to the future, it was the form of prediction. Prediction and explanation thus had the same logical structure.
How are existentialism and phenomenology historically related?
Existentialism and phenomenology both begin with the facts of human reality. From the standpoint of the first person. As distinctive traditions of thought, both have roots in the 19th century. Existentialism going back to Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881, Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855. And Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, and phenomenology originating with Franz Brentano, 1837 to 1917. Strictly speaking, existentialism is older than phenomenology. Although some 20th century existentialists have sought to base their work on that of more contemporary phenomenologists, rather than their 19th century existentialist predecessors.
Who was Gilbert Ryle and what was his thesis?
Gilbert Ryle, 1900 to 1976, was the Oxford philosophy professor who edited the journal Mind After G. E. Moore, 1873 to 1958. He is famous for having conclusively taken philosophers to task for talking about the mind as though it were the ghost in the machine. He attacked the lingering Cartesian idea of the mind as a non-physical entity related to the body in ways that could not be explained. Instead, he said statements that were about the mind should be viewed as meaningful only if they could be explained in terms of actual behavior or behavioral tendencies.
What is epistemological rationalism?
Epistemological rationalism is the position that human beings have important ideas or principles present in their minds from birth, and that the most important truths about the world can be derived from thought, without the need for experience. These a priori truths are also held to be logically certain, which is to say that it would entail a logical contradiction to deny them, and that they are absolutely certain, or, in current terminology, true in all possible worlds.
What was Marsilio Ficino's contribution to the spirit of the Renaissance?
Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, was ordained a priest in 1473. And from the center of cultural life in Florence he attempted to draw people to Christ through Platonism. Although he was the first to translate Plato's dialogues into Latin, he was not a purist. He also provided translations of Plotinus, 205 to 270, and other Neoplatonists. Ficino believed that Plato got his ideas from a legendary Egyptian magician, Hermes Trismegistus, whose work he also translated. Ficino claimed a form of wisdom that combines religion and philosophy. His own 3 books on life suggested the idea of a world soul that was connected to the world's body by occult means. In human beings, a similar relationship holds insofar as the astral body connects body and soul. This parallel structure of the world and human beings is what makes spiritual advancement, as well as the attainment of worldly goods, possible through the practice of magic. Ficino's worldview and spiritual beliefs were so clearly opposed to Aristotelian Christianity, as well as probably being heretical, that their very circula signaled important cultural changes, if not the demise of orthodoxy.
What is the romantic story involving Peter Abelard and Héloïse?
The story of Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1149. And Héloïse chronicles one of the most poignant romantic relationships in the Western tradition. It was referred to in the 1999 movie about a doorway that leads into the head of the actor John Malkovich. Being John Malkovich, in which John Cusack's character refers to Peter and Héloïse in the salacious dialogue of one of his marionette shows. Well before this movie, Cole Porter wrote, as Abelard said to Héloïse, "Don't forget to drop a line to me, please." In real life, Héloïse had written to Abelard, "The name of wife may seem more sacred or more worthy, but sweeter to me will always be the word lover, or, if you will permit me, that of concubine or whore." Abelard, at the peak of his fame and popularity, assumed the position of tutor to Héloïse. They fell in love, and he is said to have seduced her. She became pregnant, and they were secretly married. Héloïse's uncle discovered the whole affair. Claiming to be incensed by the secrecy of their marriage, he publicly denounced Abelard and then had him castrated. Peter himself recounted these events in his autobiographical work, Historia Calamitatum. Abelard told Héloïse to become a nun and he himself became a monk. They carried on a correspondence of passionate love letters. Héloïse was more enamored of Abelard than he was of her. Although castration was not an unusual punishment for the kind of betrayal of trust committed by Abelard, he was humiliated by his maiming for the rest of his life, and more or less retreated into his studies. Héloïse became the highly successful abbess of a convent. Peter and Héloïse were eventually buried together.
Why was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon against women's rights?
In his Pornocracte, 1875, Proudhon argued that if women were allowed to vote and secured other legal equalities with men, the institution of marriage would decline over time. Because women would not need men to support them financially. Proudhon thought that this single state of men and women would result in widespread prostitution.
What was Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism?
Most professional philosophers refer to Rand's, 1905 to 1982, objectivism as a so-called philosophy. Rand claimed to have taught herself the history of Western philosophy in a matter of months, which left her a passionate follower of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. She believed that Aristotle's law of identity, or A, is a metaphysical principle on which can be based the existence of an objective world that is knowable through reason. Rand remains popular on many contemporary college campuses, although more for her novels and doctrine of selfishness than for her metaphysics. Most professional philosophers before and after Rand have held A to be a tautology, telling us nothing about the world, be it objective or otherwise.
Does philosophy only deal with the big questions about life and the universe?
Not all philosophical work is about important questions. Some of it may seem absurd to non-philosophers.
Who was Jean-Paul Sartre?
Jean-Paul Charles Aimard Sartre, 1905 to 1980, was the icon of 20th-century existentialism. Popular versions of his ideas gave existentialism its dark glamour of atheistic, nihilistic, cigarette smoking, absinthe drinking, cafe frequenting. French intellectuals, arguing about ideas, and practicing free love. Sartre himself smoked a pipe, was short, stocky, nearsighted, and wall-eyed. He was well known by his contemporaries for his work in the French resistance against the Nazis, and later on, for his Marxism and opposition to the Vietnam conflict. Sartre refused to accept the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964 on the grounds of his Political objections to the bourgeois militaristic culture that made such a prize possible. Sartre's main existentialist works consisted of numerous plays and essays. The novel Nausea, 1938, and the philosophical works The Imagination, 1936. The Transcendence of the Ego, 1937, and Being and Nothingness, 1943. His Marxism was developed in the uncompleted three-volume work The Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1958 to 1959.
Ayre's version of logical positivism?
In Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936, published when he was just 26. Ayre forcefully and with great panache presented the main tenets of logical positivism as a doctrine broadly relevant to philosophy. He asserted the empiricist doctrine that all of our knowledge of the world comes from sensory experience. The truth or falsity of statements was dependent on whether they could be verified in terms of that experience. Only statements that could be true or false were meaningful. It followed from these bold claims that metaphysical, religious, and ethical statements, if they were not true by definition, could assert nothing meaningful about reality. Statements about the self, the external world, and the minds of others had to be confirmed by sensory experience, if they were to be meaningful. Concerning the existence of God, for example, Ayre maintained that the question itself was not meaningful because no possible experience could determine its truth or falsity. Ayre's ethical theory was emotivist, that is, ethical judgments were held to be expressions of emotions.
What other accomplishments are attributed to Thales?
Thales visited Mesopotamia and Egypt and studied astronomy. He predicted the solar eclipse during a battle between the Lydians and the Persians in 585 BCE. A legend has it that he changed the course of the Halys River so that King Croesus could cross it. He is said to have been able to measure the height of the pyramids and distances at sea. His practical studies in engineering may have resulted in his creation of axioms, or abstract first principles, of the field of geometry. Thales was highly regarded for his wisdom.
Was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon a friend of Karl Marx?
Very briefly.
What was René Descartes' problem with the Inquisition?
Descartes never had a direct problem with the Inquisition, but he was always afraid of church authorities, and at the same time he wanted their approval. His book on cosmology and physics, which was in accord with both atomism and Copernicanism. Was ready to publish, when he withdrew it after he heard of the Inquisition's condemnation of Galileo. In 1637, Descartes published his Optics, Meteorology, and Geometry that was prefaced with Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and reaching the truth in the sciences, 1637. Here, Descartes developed his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. An idea was clear if one could be sure about what the idea was, and distinct, if it was different from other ideas. He next published his Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641. Partly in response to criticism he had received on the Discourse on Method, 1637. The Discourse explained Descartes' new way of deriving the first principles of the sciences from a few clear and distinct ideas. The Meditations was published with a set of objections and replies from his contemporaries, including Marin Mersenne, 1588–1648, Thomas Hobbes 1588–1679, and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. And it went to a second edition in 1642. It was a completely original work in its claims that it was possible to be certain about the nature of physical reality and the existence of God based on certainty about one's own existence. Descartes' pre-publication discussions led to refinements in his position that related his ideas to the intellectual concerns of his peers. From these discussions, the Meditations became one of the most famous philosophical works. Philosophers still obsess about it in the 21st century. Descartes became increasingly concerned about intellectual attacks on him by papal authorities. His friends thought that he exaggerated the personal and professional dangers of these attacks. But Descartes' own ambition was tied up with his response to them. His thinking went to the heart of the Catholic Church's use of skepticism to deny the findings of the new science that contradicted church doctrine and scripture. It was Descartes' hope that the Jesuits would approve his ideas in the Meditations and even use it as a textbook. Descartes' next publication was Principles of Philosophy, 1644, which he believed would be a masterpiece that would gain the Church's approval.
What historical developments helped to start Renaissance humanism?
The historical period of the Renaissance is usually considered to include the years from 1450 to 1600. This time is associated with the transition between the medieval and modern periods. From its beginnings in Italy, the Renaissance was marked by a new interest in literature, poetry, and painting, in a shift of attention from the mainly religious preoccupations of life in the Middle Ages to the secular, perceptible world. The Western world changed, along with this transformation of values, the Copernican revolution radically reconfigured the place of human life in the physical cosmos. Inquiries leading to the scientific revolution began. Seeds for nation-states were sown in political thought and action. the great age of exploration and travel by Europeans to Asia, Africa, and the Americas for adventure, science, and wealth began. All of these factors during the Renaissance changed the course of philosophy.
What did Arthur Schopenhauer mean by his acronym WELT?
Schopenhauer thought the omnipresence of will was an endless cause of suffering. He even created an acronym to express this with the word Welt, or world. The letters in Welt stood for woe, elend, misery, leid, suffering, and tod, death. Schopenhauer thought that the only way out of this was to give up will by affirming the noble truths of Buddhism. Life is suffering, desire causes suffering, eliminating desire eliminates suffering. Desire can be eliminated only through a saintly life, which requires chastity, humbling of the body, and extreme poverty.
What were Voltaire's religious views?
Voltaire rejected the wager of the brilliant 17th-century mathematician Blaise Pascal, 1623–1662. The following passage from Pascal's Pensées constitutes the famous wager, God is, or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide. Nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn. Up. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will. Your knowledge and your happiness, and your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other. Since you must of necessity choose. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in. Wagering that God is. If you gain all, if you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation that he is. In other words, if we don't know whether God exists, we have two choices. We can base our life on the premise that he is. In that case, if he exists, we will go to heaven. But suppose he doesn't exist? It's still better to bet that he is, because if he isn't, we lose nothing. Whereas, if we bet that he isn't and he isn't, we are merely confirmed in our misery, but if he turns out to exist, we go to hell when we die. Voltaire would have none of this. Voltaire believed that the design evident in nature was proof of God's existence, as first cause, prime mover, and supreme intelligence. How can a benevolent and omnipotent God permit evil to exist? Voltaire was very distressed by the Lisbon earthquake and tidal wave that struck on All Saints' Day in 1755, killing thousands. In his poem Sur le Désastre de Lisbonne, 1755, He rejected both Leibnizian optimism and the doctrine of original sin. He concluded that all humans can do is accept such evil and continue to worship. In Zadig and other writings his sense of religious awe was further stressed. He maintained an attitude of tolerance for the rest of his life, with ongoing interests in the teachings of Confucius and the Quakers. In his final years, Voltaire overtly attacked the Catholic Church for its intolerance. He proclaimed, "Those who can make you believe absurdities, can make you commit atrocities."
What are some facts about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's life and career?
Merleau-Ponty's father was killed in World War I. He completed his philosophical studies at the École Normale Supérieure in 1930 and then taught in high schools throughout France. He wrote 2 dissertations for his doctorate and was given the chair of child psychology at the Sorbonne in 1949. Next, he was made chair of philosophy at the Collège de France in 1952. With Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, he founded the journal Les Temps Modernes. But he resigned from the publication as editor, partly in objection to Sartre's subject-object dichotomy. Merleau-Ponty wrote about their dispute in Adventures of the Dialectic, 1955. Overall, Merleau-Ponty opposed dualisms and he also criticized self versus world ideas. He thought that the self was as much a body as a mind and that our bodies are always in the world.
What was Berkeley's answer to whether a tree falling in the forest makes a sound?
Berkeley said that objects we sense only exist insofar as we have ideas of their sensory qualities. When we do not perceive those qualities, such as the sound of a tree falling in a forest, then they do not exist as our ideas. However, this would not entitle us to conclude that such a tree makes no sound. Our ideas of sensory qualities come to us from God, who has created them. If a tree falls in the forest and God creates the sound of its crashing down, then that idea in God's mind would guarantee the occurrence of the sound, even though human beings could not perceive it. The same reasoning was applied by Berkeley to the continued existence of a room when no people are inside it. It would still exist as a series of ideas in God's mind.
How did William Whewell describe the method of science?
In his 1837 book, History of the Inductive Sciences, Whewell described scientific methodology as a 3-part process. Beginning with a prelude of isolated facts, progressing toward laws or generalizations, and culminating in colligation by scientists during an inductive epoch in which a theory is created. The last stage is a sequel in which the theory is refined and applied to new facts.
What, besides ethics, is philosophical about environmentalism?
As mortal beings, we are all dependent on our environments. And a good part of human spirituality is centered on gratitude for how the earth supports human life, as well as the beauty of natural living and non-living things. Overall, environmentalism has encouraged a reverence for the goods of life and a good life that flows from what is not artificial or man-made and mass-produced. There are, of course, direct practical human concerns when it comes to environmentalism, as well as quality of life issues related to diminishing resources. For example, not all of the multidisciplinary experts who have studied global warming agree on its dangers or on how much of it is due to human fossil fuel consumption. Some believe that Earth has had similar changes in temperature before human industrialization. Recent and emerging studies assign high percentages of global warming to the flatulence of domestic animals raised for food, which could be considered an indirect human activity. Sorting out an issue as complex as global warming would require extensive philosophy of science.
What are the Puranic tropes?
They were what the skeptics took to be typical subjects of knowledge about which people disagreed.
Who was Jules Henri Poincaré?
Jules Henri Poincaré, 1854–1912, was a mathematician, physicist, and philosopher of science. He responded to the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry by suggesting a modification of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804, claim that we have synthetic a priori knowledge of the world, that is, certainly true knowledge that applies to reality, which is not based on experience. His proposal was what became known as conventionalism, namely that physicists will retain Euclidean geometry because it has the simplest geometrical conventions and is therefore appropriate for them. This proposal was short-lived in mathematics, because Albert Einstein was to show in his general theory of relativity that the curvature of space obeyed the principles of non-Euclidean geometry. However, the broader principle of conventionalism, namely that truth in science depends on agreement about specified rules, was to be revived as an idea of scientific truth in the 20th century.
What was William Whewell's intuitionist moral philosophy?
Whewell, 1794–1866, claimed that conscience enables direct perception of moral goodness and badness. However, he did not describe conscience as a separate moral faculty but as reason exercised on moral subjects. Moral rules are primary principles of reason, discoverable by reason itself. He took them to be self-evident necessary truths.
What was Pico della Mirandola known for?
Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463-1494, is most famous for his oration on the dignity of man, which was the introduction to his 900 Theses, which he wrote in order to debate publicly in Rome. A papal commission censored 13 of the Theses, but after Pico attempted to justify them with his apology, they were all condemned by Pope Innocent VIII, 1432-1492. Pico sought refuge in France, and after he was imprisoned there he went back home to Florence, where he continued his writing. He had a strong interest in the same Hermetic tradition introduced by Ficino, although he argued against part of it in his disputations against astrology. While Pico's oration on the dignity of man has been heralded as a classic example of Renaissance humanism, Pico believed that the dignity of man was located in his proper place in the cosmos. The freedom of man, which Pico is so famous for proclaiming, is thus not the freedom for human beings to create themselves or chart their own destinies, but rather the traditional Christian freedom of being able to choose between good and evil as defined by Christianity.
What was philosophical about the thought of Desiderius Erasmus?
Desiderius Erasmus, 1466-1536, was born in Holland as the illegitimate son of a priest. He became widely known and highly respected throughout England and Europe for his biblical translations and ideas about religion. He was one of the first thinkers after antiquity to admit to skepticism in religious debates. His Moride Encomium, in praise of folly, reintroduced the idea of a simple, pious Christianity. However, when Martin Luther, 1483-1546, tried to enlist his support in the Protestant Reformation, he resisted taking his side. When Luther criticized him for this, Erasmus responded with On Free Will, in which he argued that it was impossible to know, as Luther claimed to know, that man did not have free will. Erasmus was not himself a philosopher, but he made fun of the preoccupations of the scholastics and inaugurated their subsequent reputation as intellectually trivial. Through his influence in Europe on its educational systems, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew became more widely taught. Overall, he was a great supporter of the kind of critical spirit that many scholars believe eventually produced the Enlightenment.
How do the Chichlans account for perceptions of meaning?
Meaning is fixed by networks of association. Ultimately, meaning will be replaced by connectionist networks with activation along preferred vectors. Sameness of meaning is no more than a sameness of patterns. In the library of the future, there will be plugs for directly activating relevant brain states and patterns. bypassing the need to transmit meanings via language as we now know it.
What was the debate between the Pyrrhonian and academic skeptics?
Pyrrhonian skepticism was founded by Aenesidemus in the early 1st century B. CE. Aenesidemus claimed to be merely passing on the thoughts of Pharo of Elis, c. 315 to 255 BCE. Sextus Empiricus, 160 to 210 CE, preserved Pyrrhonian skepticism in the 2nd century after Aenesidemus. Pyrrhonian skeptics thought that the academic skeptics went too far in claiming that nothing could be truly known for certain. The Pyrrhonians preferred to suspend judgment on whether anything could be known. They held that suspending judgment led to ataraxiapies of mind in which there was simply no concern for what may or may not lie behind appearances or come after them. Pyrrhonian skeptics were opposed to dogmatism and believed that their chief philosophic opponents were the Stoics.
What are some key facts about Edmund Burke's life?
Edmund Burke was born in Ireland in 1729. He attended Trinity College in Dublin, and then moved to London, hoping to read law, but he was never called to the bar. Instead, he wrote A Vindication of Natural Society and Philosophical Inquiry into Our Ideas on the Sublime and the Beautiful, both published in 1756 by the bookseller Robert Dodley, who also commissioned him to write an abridgment of the history of England, which he never completed. His Vindication was deliberately written in the style of the Tory statesman Lord Bolingbroke, who in overblown ways praised a pure state of nature compared to civilization, although Burke argued for the opposite. His imitation of Bolingbroke was so convincing that many readers thought Bolingbroke had written it. Burke's theory of art was opposed to the classicist value of clarity. He thought that great art is mysterious and evocative and that the sublime inspires fear. He wrote, "It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration and chiefly excites our passions."
How does Martin Heidegger embarrass the Heideggerians?
Heidegger's political beliefs and behavior when the Nazis came to power have generated much controversy. Based on the following documented facts. Heidegger paid dues as a member of the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, from 1933 to 1945. In his inaugural address in May 1933 as rector of Freiburg University, 3 months after Hitler came to power, he called for the students and faculty to serve the new regime, referring to the march our people has begun into its future history and to the power to preserve, in the deepest way, the strengths which are rooted in soil and blood. In June 1933, he told the Heidelberg Student Association that the university must be integrated into the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, and be joined together with the state. In August 1933, he established the rule that the rector would no longer be elected by the faculty but appointed by the Nazi Minister of Education, a position to which he was himself appointed in October 1933. In November 1933, he applied the Nazi laws on racial cleansing to the students at Freiburg, awarding financial aid to Aryan students, but not to Jews or Marxists. Heidegger also secretly denounced to the Nazi government a number of Jewish or politically suspect professors at Freiburg, such as Hermann Staudinger, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1953, and Eduard Baumgarten, the pragmatist philosopher who was teaching at Göttingen. Max Müller, the Catholic intellectual, was fired by Heidegger as student leader and prevented from getting a lectureship. Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938, Heidegger's former teacher, was denied use of the university library at Freiburg because he was a Jew even though he had converted to Lutheranism. Heidegger and Husserl's intellectual relationship is examined in the film The Easter, directed by David Bar-Eisen and Daniel Ross in 2004. Although Heidegger resigned as rector in 1934, the next year he referred to the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism. At least until 1960, Heidegger maintained a friendly acquaintance with Eugen Fischer, the head of the Institute of Racial Hygiene in Berlin that employed the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele as a researcher. Heidegger never repudiated Nazism after World War II. In his lecture on technology in 1949, he referred to the mechanism of agriculture, saying, "Agriculture is now a motorized food industry in essence. The same as the manufacturing of corpses in the gas chambers and the extermination camps. The same as the blockade and starvation of the countryside, the same as the production of the hydrogen bombs." Many were offended by this comparison by Heidegger of murdered Jews to agricultural products. In a last interview before his death, Heidegger described the main task of thought as achieving a satisfactory relationship to technology. He said that National Socialism had that goal but that those people were far too limited in their thinking to acquire an explicit relationship to what is really happening today and has been underway for 3 centuries. In other words, his greatest disappointment with the Nazis was their failure in addressing the problem of technology.
What is Thomas Kuhn's paradigm theory?
Although Kuhn himself noted that he used the word paradigm in at least 23 different ways in the first edition of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. The core meaning is that a paradigm defines and prescribes how research is conducted in a science. And it also presents a picture of the world as studied by that science. During normal science, all practitioners are expected to work within the reigning paradigm of their field and extend accepted theories to new circumstances. there is widespread agreement on one coherent worldview in a mature science. In immature sciences, competing schools of thought have followers who defend the paradigm of the viewpoint they subscribe to. Paradigms are not absolutely true for all time and can be literally overthrown by the adoption of new paradigms.
What were Arthur Schopenhauer's main ideas?
Schopenhauer offered an original interpretation of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 metaphysics based on additional inspiration. He wrote, "I owe what is best in my own development to the impression made by Kant's works. The sacred writings of the Hindus, and Plato." In his dissertation, he argued that Kant's phenomenal world, or the world of our experience, which Schopenhauer called the world of representation, obeys the principle of sufficient reason. Which he stated this way: every possible object stands in a necessary relation to other objects. On the one hand as determined, on the other as determining. That is, everything is both a cause and an effect, and these relations are necessary. Which is to say that they cannot be denied without logical contradiction. Kant's noumenal world, or the things in themselves, of which we can know nothing except that they exist, became knowable, according to Schopenhauer, through our inner reality, which is our will. Again following Kant, because mathematics or numbers are projections of the mind that enable us to experience phenomena. Schopenhauer felt that the noumenal world has no number, it is one. This claim would have no consequences in experience if it were true, since it is an effort to describe what underlies experience.
What has been important in second-wave feminist political philosophy?
The concept of patriarchy, or rule by fathers, throughout human history sparked much social and textual analysis, which was brought to theoretical completion by Carol Pateman in The Sexual Contract, 1988. Pateman argued that when modern social contract theory was constructed by Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and John Locke, 1632–1704, women were left out of the political equation and relegated to private life. Iris Young, 1949–2006, a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, addressed the connection between female social roles and political structures in Justice and the Politics of Difference, 1990, and Inclusion and Democracy, 2000. Young also addressed women's disempowered bodily comportment in her 1980 essay Throwing Like a Girl, included in a book by the same name in 1990. In addition, feminist philosophers have welcomed and discussed the work of University of Michigan Law School professor Catherine McKinnon.
What were Hippocrates' accomplishments and influence?
In founding his own school, Hippocrates, 465 to 370 CE, formally established medicine as distinct from theurgy, natural magic, and philosophy. He himself had learned medicine from his father and grandfather. According to the Hippocratic school, illness was caused by an imbalance of four humors that were supposed to be equal in the body: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Every disease progressed to a crisis, from which either death or natural recovery would ensue. Hippocratic medical practice was passive because it was believed that the body would heal itself given rest and immobilization. The therapy was always gentle, and usually only clean water, wine, or balms were used. Being able to predict the course of an illness was considered important. In his On the Physician, Hippocrates stressed good grooming and a sober demeanor for doctors. It was important to keep records, not only about the patient but also about the patient's family and circumstances. Mystical causes of illness were dismissed. After Hippocrates' death, there was little advancement in the principles attributed to him, and some of his professional rules, such as taking case histories and keeping records, fell into disuse.
Who was Simone de Beauvoir?
Simone de Beauvoir, 1908 to 1986, is now most famous as the philosopher who began the second wave of feminism in the West. She began writing when she was 8 years old and was a novelist and political writer who helped Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, her main lifelong companion, found Le Monde. De Beauvoir's major works include the novels She Came to Stay, 1943, The Blood of Others, 1945, and The Mandarins, 1954, and her philosophical texts The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, The Second Sex, 1949, and Old Age, 1970. She also wrote evocative autobiographical works, such as Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, 1958. De Beauvoir ruthlessly described Sartre's great decline toward the end of his life in Adieu, A Farewell to Sartre, 1981. Beauvoir also quarreled fiercely with Arlette Elcom, the young Jewish Algerian student who had contacted Sartre when she was 18. Sartre enjoyed discussing his philosophy with Elcom, and he preferred to write in her apartment, instead of following his lifetime habit of writing in cafes. Then he adopted her and bought her a house in the south of France, which became their summer vacation home. Beauvoir had an adopted daughter of her own, Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir, with whom she had had an erotic relationship, although Sylvie later described it as platonic. Sylvie wrote Tête-à-Tête, 2005, about de Beauvoir and Sartre. In 2005, Sylvie and Sartre's daughter were not on speaking terms, each in her 60s. They continued to bitterly contest their respective rights to Sartre and de Beauvoir's literary properties. Since Sartre and de Beauvoir are inextricably linked through letters in which they discussed each other. The complexity of the dispute between their literary heiresses can only be imagined. By 2005, Sylvie was a retired philosophy teacher and Arlette was described as extremely reclusive. Geographically, these women had lived close to each other in the same Parisian arrondissement, for some years. Beauvoir had a high tolerance for alcohol all her life. She liked its taste, but drank more heavily in her later years. She was also hooked on amphetamines. When she died in 1986, she was buried in Sartre's grave, thereby sealing their link for posterity.
Does philosophy have anything to do with ordinary life, today?
Yes. Philosophy has a lot to do with our daily lives. But, depending on the reader's interests, some parts of it will seem more relevant than others. And some parts of philosophy are more abstract than others.
Why is materialism important regarding the analytic philosophy of mind?
Whether the mind is equated with the physical brain or held to be closely connected to it. Analytic philosophers of mind have been united in a materialist view since Gilbert Ryle, 1900 to 1976, wrote The Concept of Mind, 1949.
Who was Hannah Arendt?
Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, was a German-American social and political philosopher who taught at the New School after World War II. She attended the University of Marburg, where she began the affair with Martin Heidegger. 1889 to 1976, that was to become a lifelong relationship. They broke up and came together repeatedly. Arendt wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine with Karl Jaspers, 1883 to 1969, at Heidelberg University. She was married to the philosopher Gunther Enders, 1902 to 1992, in 1929, but they divorced. In 1937, she was not allowed to continue her habilitation because she was a Jew. After beginning an investigation on anti-Semitism, she was questioned by the Gestapo. She then went to France, and worked with Walter Benjamin, 1892 to 1940, in helping Jewish refugees. Her own imprisonment at Camp Gurs ended with her escape. In 1940 Arendt married Heinrich Blücher, 1899 to 1970, a poet, philosopher, and former communist. With Blücher and her mother, she escaped to the United States from Vichy France on phony visas, with the assistance of Hiram Bingham IV, an American diplomat. After World War II, Arendt testified for Heidegger in a denazification hearing. and she wrote an admiring essay about his work in a philosophical celebration of his 80th birthday. Arendt was director of research for the Commission of European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which led to frequent returns to Germany after 1944. In the United States she taught at the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton University, Northwestern University, and the New School. She was not particularly progressive in the American social context, supporting racial segregation at the beginning of the civil rights movement, and refusing to be identified as a feminist during the period of women's liberation. Her main works are The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, The Human Condition, 1958. On Revolution, 1963, On Violence, 1970, Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, and The Life of the Mind, 1978.
Were Pyrrhonic skeptics anxious about the impossibility of knowledge?
No. Pyrrhonic skeptics were reluctant to commit themselves on either opposing side of an issue and instead cultivated ataraxia, a mental state of peace and quiet. Pyrrhonic skepticism was supposed to be a cure for the disease of dogmatism, in which positions on truths that were not evident were taken up and defended, causing distress. 3rd century Pyrrhonists organized this process into sets of 2, 5, or 10 tropes, each one of which suggested how to suspend judgments about matters that went beyond appearances.
What was Søren Kierkegaard's burning question?
For Kierkegaard, the most important question was whether there was a God, and thereby an afterlife. He did not think that question could be answered by any marshalling of the appropriate facts or through an intellectual process of any kind. It was a rational question, but there was no answer to it. The only acceptable answer was an actual leap of faith within and by the individual. Furthermore, insofar as the facts of the world rendered the possibility of God and an afterlife absurd, this absurdity itself is a test of faith. The more absurd something seems to be, the greater the faith necessary to believe it. Kierkegaard thought that great faith was the key to being a Christian. To this end, he deployed the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to take Isaac up a mountain and then sacrifice him. This act is pathological in ordinary terms, but in religious terms, for Kierkegaard, it is the quintessential example of a leap of faith.
Who were the right and left Hegelians?
Active interest in Friedrich Hegel's ideas died out soon after his death in 1843. But his influence has nonetheless continued in much 20th century thought. His ideas were immediately interpreted by the right Hegelians. who believed that the Prussian state represented the final union of philosophy and Christianity, and the left Hegelians, including Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach, 1804–1872, and Karl Marx, 1818–1883. Who interpreted a politically revolutionary future for the dialectic propounded by Hegel.